Chapter 15 of Across the Andes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Steffi. Across the Andes by Charles Johnson Post. Shooting the Ratama. At daybreak, we left the Waisipuri Baraka, and emptying our rifles in salute to the Englishman's Winchester, we started on for the next rapids, the greatest rapids on the river, the Ratama. 2 miles above the Ratama, the walls of the gorge began to close in steep cliffs. Here and there, shrubs clung on little niches, while from the high edges long vines hung down and were whip-taut in the swift, glassy current below. The air began to cool in the deep shadows, and there was a damp chill in it like the breath from a cavern. The lechos were not chattering now, for this place may on any trip prove to be serious, and the silence of the smooth drifting was only broken by an occasional kingfisher which clattered by like a flying watchman's rattle. Slowly, a dull roaring, echoing from the distance, steadily obtruded itself. The current was still glassy, but as it moved, it snapped against the walls of the canyon in angry ripples. Every lecho in the crew was poised, with his paddle as tense as a strongbow. Now we knew who was the captain of the crew. It was the forward lecho on the right. He was the only one who had anything to say. It was no childish joking now. There were commands. Occasionally he grunted his order, and the paddles dipped as they held the raft true, bow on, in the middle of the current. With a grand sweep, we swung round and bent between the walls of rock, and there far ahead, the white waves of the Ratama were snapping like great fangs against the dusk of the canyon, while above them hung a heavy mist that blurred the outlines of the gorge beyond. The Kalapo increased its speed. The Ratama seemed to be springing toward us with each leaping wave. The roaring water deepened, and the voices were drowned. The lecho captain dipped his paddle, and the rest followed the signal, and gently the Kalapo was held true, with the tree upturned snout headed straight for the foaming center. The cliffs had closed in like the walls of a corridor, and they flew past like the flickering film of a moving picture. The spray from the trailing vines was whipped in our faces and floated upward to form rainbows in the slanting sunlight high overhead. Then, for a second, we seemed to pause on the edge of a long slide of polished water, the edge of the cataract. The lechos crouched for the shock, and we could fairly feel their toes gripping the submerged Kalapo logs, while their paddles were poised above their heads. Then came the brief coast down the smooth water and the plunge into the great wave that loomed above our heads, only to break with a drenching roar over us and the lashed freight. The lechos dropped on their knees, gripping a hold as best they might, their eyes glittering with excitement, and I could see their wide-open mouths in a yell of wild joy, though every sound was drowned in the crash and roar of waters. The paddles swung in powerful circles, and at each dip the paddlers went out of sight, head and shoulders in the smother of foam. The water was above my waist, and somewhere below the surface I was hanging on to the cargo lashings, with my feet braced against the logs. Under the boiling smother of foam, I could feel the Kalapo writhe and twist in the strain. A keg broke loose, and a lecho lost his paddle in recovering it. His paddle was of no consequence, for he could whittle another, and he fondly believed the keg held the beloved alcohol, Cañasa, though he was wrong, for it held nothing but pickled beef, and worthless, as I later found. Sometimes, a lecho's shoulder would rise above the boiling smother, with the brown muscles playing in hard knots. Sometimes we would sluice side onto the current, and no power could hold us straight until a bursting wave would throw us back. Sometimes, for an instant, the dripping snouts of the calipo would be flung high in the air and fall back with a crash that made itself heard above the roar, and the raft would quiver and strain with the impact. One saw nothing. We might have been standing still. There was nothing but the lashing sting of the whirling spray and the thunder of the cataract. Then, in an instant, the roar and the tumult were behind. The waves calmed, and the calipo shot out into the calmer waters below, where the whirlpools and eddies shifted and coiled. Vortices, into which one might lower a barrel without wetting it, whirled lazily past within paddle reach, and sometimes one would suddenly form ahead, and the lechos would watch them intently as to their possible direction, and then paddle to shift our course. These they can generally avoid. It is when one forms or suddenly comes up from underneath that there is danger. A few did catch us this way, and the lechos would stand with braced feet, reading by the straining logs the possible strength of the vortex, and the calipo would grind and slowly sink, until by sheer mass it broke the force of the whirl. Often we would go down by the stern until the after lechos kept only their heads above water, and even we, farther forward, would be submerged up to our shoulders. There was nothing to do but wait until the vortex broke off itself. In the Ratama, the roar and excitement drowned any emotion, but this was slowly waiting in uncertainty and speculating on how far one could really swim before being drawn under like a chip. Not far, that was certain, and the lechos watched the shifting, coiling passage in a silent gravity that they had shown nowhere else on the river. It is the breaking up of the logs and cargo that make the danger, at least to the lecho, greater than the power of the river itself, and a white man would have no chance. From the Ratama, the river and the country back of it opened out, and the last of the eastern Andean foothills were almost past. A few more rapids were left, the Nube, the Incaguara, the Bayo, and the Bala, but after the Ratama, they dwindled to armless riffles. The Bayo canyons resound with a deafening roar, but it is from the thousands of macaws that have their nest in the soft sandstone cliffs, and it is their clatter that carries for miles in the soft evening airs. Presently, the chief of the Lecho crew chattered with the others. They argued, each according to his recollection, for down somewhere on this stretch of the river, it was the river Caca, now since being joined by the river Tipuani and the Coroico River, mountain torrents both, there was an old camp that was our objective. The jungle had long since wiped out every trace, and there was nothing to depend upon but the memory of the lechos. As a matter of fact, there probably is nothing that could be more reliable. It is the one thing they know, is this river, and every turn, every eddy, every tree or drooping vine along the banks is marked down in their primitive minds with the vividness of painted signs. The calapos, strung out each in the wake of the other, drifting around a long turn of smooth, swift water. The chief grunted, the crew clattered and grunted back in obvious affirmation. The paddles dipped, and from the following calapos came a yell as they, too, began to splash and pry their way out of the current. One after the other, they swung round and bumped into shallow water. On the heavy gravel of a playa beyond rose a steep bank overgrown with masses of creeper and jungle. The lechos chopped away in with their machetes, and with a grunt, a lecho announced the find. There was a tent peg, a broken kettle, a broken bottleneck, and a bit of rope. It was the proof of the site of the previous camp in its exact location. 5 minutes later, the lashings were off the freight, and a splashing line of Indians and cholos were bringing the freight ashore. Here was to be established the permanent camp. The long journey from the coast had reached its goal. The lechos and the cholo workmen were still splashing through the muddy shallows from the grounded calapos, packing the freight for the camp, when Agamemnon announced himself as cook. Before this moment, he had idly occupied himself as valet, butler, laundress, at least since leaving La Paz, faithful adviser, major domo, village gossip, and occasionally the village drunkard. And now, when he announced himself as cook, no husk of humility can conceal the fact that he regarded all other cook possibilities in that camp on the Rio Caca with a scornful contempt. Later, it developed that at this particular time, his sole knowledge of cooking was confined to an ability to make guava jelly, an accomplishment which, in view of the fact that we were somewhere around 500 miles by trail and raft from civilization, was of no service at the moment. The difficulty over the cook's situation had arisen suddenly in the first hour of making camp. Back in Mapiri, there was a certain fat little cholo who had sewed a strip of red flannel down his trouser legs in sign of the fact that under some circumstances he was the Mapiri police force. What these circumstances might be never developed, for during our long wait he was busy at nothing more official than taking care of the sugarcane distillery that belonged to the intendant. Before that, rumor had it, he had taught school in Guanay down the river with a row of empty cañasa bottles, by means of which he illustrated addition and subtraction. This was as far as the school went. With that course completed, it issued its diploma. This little cholo urged himself as cook, and, as we needed a cook, he was added. As it turned out, he was probably the only man in Bolivia who could not cook, or at any rate, the only one who had never passed the stage of being able to boil water. When the calapos swung into the playa and grounded on the shallow beach, the cook started to get his first meal. The water was brought to a boil successfully in a large kettle between two logs. Presently, it began to exude half-cooked rice, and cheerfully the fat cholo added another kettle to hold the overflow. Presently, also, both kettles began to exude half-cooked rice, and two more kettles were added to the logs. Once again, the pot seethed and frothed, and again came forth the overflow of half-cooked rice, still swelling from 4 interminable geysers. Dolly, the cholo, beat at it with an iron spoon, and the lechos grinned at him as they filled their little pots with the overflow. Heaven alone knows how much rice the cook started with, but in the end, half the fire was drowned out. Every lecho had his little pot of half-raw rice, a row of big jungle leaves at each their little mound of rice alongside the fire log, and the hot tropic air was drifting sluggishly with the odor of burnt rice. And every pot and kettle in camp held remnants of the salvage. Therefore, it was that Agamemnon became cook. End of chapter 15.